Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I have come to the floor this evening to speak about our nation's strategic petroleum reserve. We sometimes refer to it as the SPR or the SPRO, but it is a national security asset that has come into the news of late for a host of different reasons. And I'm here this evening because of the concerns that I have that others are potentially looking to our strategic petroleum reserve, our strategic energy asset, as nothing more than a piggy bank to fund some of the needs that we have here in this Congress. Mr. President, I believe it is extremely short-sighted to raid our nation's oil stockpile as an offset for the extension of the Highway Trust Fund. And that's what we have had some conversation about today. We had a vote earlier about whether or not to move forward on the Highway Trust Fund. But as we have looked to find paths forward for a multi-year highway trust fund reauthorization, which is something that I support, it's important to know that not all pots of money are equal, that perhaps some are truly our national security assets that perhaps we need to show more considered respect. I had an opportunity a few days ago on Friday to go to tour a strategic petroleum reserve. I went to the Choctaw Bayou, a site near Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and it was an opportunity for me to get a firsthand look at some of the challenges that currently face our four strategic petroleum reserves that we have down in Louisiana, Texas area, and to have a better understanding as to their operational readiness. And quite honestly, Mr. President, it's a trip that I wish more of our members were willing to take, because I think it would become clear to many of the potential mistake that we would be making in forcing the sale of billions of dollars of our emergency oil solely to pay for unrelated legislation. It's akin to selling the insurance on your house in order to pave your driveway. It just doesn't make sense to do. Now, for some, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve may be a very unknown national security asset. They don't really know what it is. But the SPRO, the SPR, is our nation's insurance policy against global energy supply disruptions. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was established by law back in 1975 under the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, and its mission is twofold: to ensure U.S. energy security by reducing the impacts of potential disruptions in U.S. petroleum supplies, and then secondly, to carry out U.S. obligations under the International Energy Program. So we've got about 700 million barrels of oil that are tucked away in underground salt caverns, again, down in Louisiana and in Texas. We have a couple refined product reserve in other parts of the country, but our strategic petroleum reserves are there in Louisiana and Texas. So if you have a major hurricane that takes out production in the Gulf of Mexico, as we saw with Hurricane Katrina back in 2005, we can turn to the SPR to help fill the gap. We did that in 2005. Exactly the type of reason that you would have this strategic asset. But there are other times that we have turned to the SPR. If you have a terrorist attack or a broader war disruption that alters our ability for other nations to send us oil, we can again turn to the reserve for help. We did this in 1991 with the Iraq War, and then again in 2011 with the Libya supply disruption. So again, when there was an emergency and we needed to ensure the U.S. security, we had a ready reserve fund to turn to. In the absence of policies that will allow our nation to produce all of the oil that it consumes every day, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is really our best answer to the sudden absence of the energy that we need, whether it's driving to work, whether it is powering our ships or our airplanes, moving our goods, whatever that reason may be. But the discussion that was being had today in terms of how we pay for this multi-year transportation bill, we're being asked to dramatically diminish the size of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve based, again, on the need to pay for the extension of the Highway Trust Fund. Totally unrelated, totally unrelated. And those that would argue in favor of taking from the SPR, their argument's pretty simple, and in fact, it's way too simple. They suggest that our international obligations require us to store enough petroleum to match 90 days of net imports. That is true. And they will say that given the growth that we've seen in domestic oil production, we have enough now that we've got a surplus within the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Some have even suggested that an SPR is not even necessary anymore. Well, Mr. President, I would be the first among us to suggest that changes do need to be made to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Again, this was established back in 1975. And I think it's very fair to say that the world has changed. It's changed dramatically since the 70s. The global environment in which we're operating has changed dramatically. And the Department of Energy has said that, that today the impacts of an overall supply disruption of global oil markets would have the same effect on domestic petroleum product prices, regardless of how U.S. oil import levels or whether or not U.S. refineries import crude from disrupted countries. So there's a recognition that we've got to get to modernizing the SPRO. We have to ensure that we have right-sized it, that we are in alignment when it comes to moving oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve at those times that we have determined is appropriate. And so I think it is important to know that we're not just sitting still on this. The Department of Energy has they've begun work on a comprehensive, long-term, strategic review of the SPR, and we had good discussion about this when I was down there in Louisiana on Friday with the Deputy Secretary of Energy, Chris Smith, talking about what this review will entail. It's looking at future SPR requirements regarding the size, regarding the composition of it, the geographic location. It's been suggested that perhaps there might be regional approaches, determining where we have choke points within the system in terms of distribution, how we move it, determining the impacts of what we see globally and what is happening with our own domestic production. And again, being smart in how we are making sure that we have right-sized the SPRO and in fairness, modernized the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We have a committee process, Mr. Chairman, as you know, that likes to roll up our sleeves and get into the weeds on making sure that our policies are current, are relevant. We need a deliberative process that will provide us with a proper understanding of the stakes and our options when it comes to how we handle our Strategic Petroleum Reserve. What we do not need is an arbitrary process that just kind of picks a number. And right now, for purposes of the offset that they're coming to the Energy Committee for, they're picking a number of, let's sell 101 million barrels of oil to fund a portion of the Highway Trust Fund. Again, where's the connection here between ensuring that we don't erode our national energy security assets? I have said many times, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is not an ATM. It is certainly not the petty cash drawer for Congress. We've got a responsibility here. A decision to sell substantial volumes of oil will increase our vulnerability to future supply disruptions at a time when we're still importing oil. We're importing about 5 million barrels per day. But think about this. Think about the timing of this, Mr. President. It simply could not be worse. You know, when you talk about volatility in the world, think about the news that you read about today, what's happening in Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Now is the time for us to say that our national energy security assets are not that important. It's okay to kind of nibble around the edges, or worse, take significant amounts to put out on the market. So let's just consider a few facts to put into perspective here. First of all, you talk about the market. It's a buyer's market out there, Mr. President. The International Energy Agency warns of a massively oversupplied balance sheet. The Energy Information Administration shares that assessment in its latest monthly outlook, noting that production continues to exceed consumption across the globe. And of course, now as we are seeing the outcome from the negotiations with Iran, they're going to be in a position soon to put their oil out onto the world market. Oil prices are sitting right now around $50 a barrel. So think about it. Not all of the oil that is in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was perhaps bought high, but think about it. Selling it now is the very definition of selling low. We're at $50 a barrel right now. The sales that are envisioned in this highway bill would both shortchange taxpayers in terms of emergency protection, because you're eroding the fund, but think about the proper stewardship of taxpayer dollars. Effectively, we bought high and we're sure going to sell low. Second, drawing down barrels from the SPR would put the federal government in a position of direct competition with domestic producers. And that may be temporarily defensible during a severe interruption, but let's remember, again, where we are right now. The mid-continent is already awash with crude. Our outdated ban on oil exports, which should be fully repealed, and fully repealed soon, in my view, it's not been repealed yet. It's sitting there in place, and what it's doing is it's keeping oil trapped in the United States, threatening productions and jobs at the same time. So what you're talking about here with this proposal to sell off the oil from SPRO is you're going to sell it first very low, and then you're going to put it into a market that is already oversupplied. I was down in the Gulf of Mexico this weekend at a place called Port Fourchon, where truly you think about the part of the country that is supporting an oil and gas industry, robust, ready to go to work. But what you saw there with supply vessels that were sidelined, drill ships that were waiting, you tell those hardworking men and women there who aren't working as hard as they would like that perhaps somehow it's a good idea that we should be taking money from our savings account, taking the oil from our savings account and dumping that into the market. The third point here, our nation's energy security cannot depend on commercial stocks alone. They rise, they fall based on market expectations, and not on the strategic environment, and they're not tethered to our nation's energy security. Since the passage of the Energy Policy and Conservation Act back in 1975, there was a bipartisan consensus that maintained that it's the federal government, not private industry, that will ensure that our obligations are met. And so clearly, not much has changed in that calculation, certainly in my mind. And then finally, threats to global security continue to abound, and in fact, they just seem to worsen. As Iran and ISIS and other threats destabilize the Middle East, some 17 million barrels per day still flow through the Straits of Hormuz. The Suez Canal and its accompanying pipeline carrying just under 5 million barrels per day, despite a budding insurgency that fired a rocket at an Egyptian Navy vessel earlier this month. Instability in Venezuela, which produces about 2.5 million barrels per day, would also directly impact the major American refining center in the Gulf of Mexico. So you have all of this volatility, all of this instability. And really, this is the time, again, that we're going to take our insurance policy, we're going to erode it, we're going to make us less energy secure. Makes no sense. Now, by way of comparison, the drawdown rate of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is about 4.4 million barrels today, probably a little bit less. But seriously, any number of disruptions could arise and make those barrels very, very precious. Secretary Moniz gave a speech just about a month ago, and he stated that it is this distribution rate of 4.4 is, the distribution rate is probably much lower than our drawdown capacity of 4.4, and the distribution rate is compromised because of some of the issues that we talked about earlier, which is changes in midstream infrastructure, congestions in the system. So when you talk about our ability to respond, we're limited. So if Congress is going to sell any oil from the SPRO, and I'm not suggesting that this is a good idea, one of the things that we must do is that we should agree that any proceeds would first be used to pay for upgrading the reserve itself, pay for the modernization, help to ensure that it has the ability to do that which we have tasked it to do. It needs significant modifications to preserve its long-term viability and to ensure that it can truly move the oil in the event of an emergency, whether it's a natural disaster or whether it's a terrorist threat or war. But it would be a travesty, Mr. President, if we were to dramatically reduce the size of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve while we continue to ignore its maintenance and its operational needs. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve must be modernized for the 21st century. Its size, its geographic disposition, the quality of oil that it stores. Right now it's about 1/3 to 2/3 distribution between sweet and sour crude. The desirability and understanding if we need to move more into a refined products storage or holding instead of the crude. These are all issues that merit further attention. But we need to have a deliberative process. We need the review that the Department of Energy is conducting. We need the review that committees such as ours will advance and consider. What we do not need is a spur-of-the-moment deal that would sacrifice our energy security and perhaps much more. So, Mr. President, I know that the conversation will continue about how we move a highway bill forward. Count me as one that wants to ensure that we're doing right by our highway systems. Our infrastructure is key, but we also have key energy infrastructure. And part of that key infrastructure lies with the security asset, the strategic petroleum reserve that we have. Let's focus on that word strategic before we move too quickly and in a manner that is short-sighted and will jeopardize our security and our ability to respond. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.